Well, this morning, both in worship and in ABC, we're kicking off this new series. It is called The Fill in the Blank That Stole Christmas. And in this series, we're going to try to fill in this blank with some of the most common things that steal some of the joy from what is supposed to be a great season, a magical season, a wonderful season, an exciting season, and yet sometimes it doesn't always feel like all of those things. In fact, I was thinking about this. When I was a kid, Christmas was my favorite time of the year. It was a season that was full of joy and full of magic and full of wonder and full of excitement and full of anticipation. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon, and one of the traditions that we had growing up was that my dad would take me and my siblings down to the Columbia River to see the boats on the river, because every year around this time, they would always put lights on the boats. And so we'd go down to the river and we would see boats that look like that. That's kind of cool. Or see boats that look like that. That's kind of cool. This is my favorite boat. We would see boats that sometimes even look like that. Now that person put some serious work into that boat. And when you're a kid and you see boats with lights on them sailing down the river, and the lights kind of reflect off the water of the river, it really is kind of an amazing, overwhelming, sensory-inspiring experience. And so I used to love going down to see the boats when I was a kid, but then a funny thing happened along the way to adulthood. I got older, and the season that was once full of good news and great joy and magic and wonder, it turned into something that at times felt just a little bit overwhelming. Instead of marveling at Christmas lights, now I'm worried about putting Christmas lights up. Instead of being overjoyed at receiving Christmas presents, now I'm worried about going out to the mall and buying them. Instead of snarfing down a holiday meal with all the fixins, now I'm worried about making the holiday meal. Instead of enjoying all the holiday traditions and festivities, now I'm worried about going to all the holiday traditions and festivities on top of all the normal stuff that I always have to do all the time. Christmas, as an adult, doesn't feel quite the same to me as Christmas did when I was a kid. Now, my guess is maybe, just maybe, you can relate a little bit. Here's the deal. If you're here today and you're having just a little bit of trouble getting into the Christmas spirit, enjoying the good news of the great joy that is supposed to be this time of year, if you are feeling a little bit stressed about the Christmas chaos, then this series is the series for you. Because in this series, we're just taking a look at some of the things that can steal the joy of Christmas, and we're going to talk about how to get that joy back. And so this morning, as we kick off our series, we're going to be talking about materialism. The materialism that stole Christmas is going to be our topic for today. Now, I need to be honest with you up front, and I do need to say that in a lot of ways, in our culture, in our society, and in our country, materialism is kind of a driving force behind Christmas, right? 30% of the retail sales that occur annually happen between Black Friday and Christmas Day. So think about that. Over a fourth of all retail sales happen in about a 12th of the calendar year. That's a big uptick. It's a big deal. It's part of what keeps our economy chugging along, but it's also kind of part and parcel of materialism. Black Friday last year saw 101.7 million people who went out to shop. I don't know why when you can buy it online, but 101.7 million people went out to shop. That was up from 2015 when only 74 million people went out to shop. The average amount that is spent per shopper on Christmas gifts, $967.13, almost $1,000. Because of the retail rush this time of year, retailers have to hire on average between 500,000 and 550,000 extra workers just to take care of everything. Christmas is a season that in a lot of ways is driven by materialism. Here's the problem. Materialism really can steal the joy out of Christmas. I want you to do a little time of self-reflection, okay? You don't got to say anything out loud or raise your hand or do anything like that. Just answer in your own mind these questions. Have you ever been stressed because finances were tight and you didn't know if you were going to be able to afford what you felt you needed to buy for Christmas? If so, then you struggled with materialism. Have you ever gone into debt to buy all sorts of things you couldn't really afford just by putting it on a credit card and then regretting it come January when the interest rate and the payment hits? If so, then you struggle with materialism. Have you ever had one of your kids throw a temper tantrum because they didn't get what they thought they absolutely needed for Christmas? If so, then they've struggled with materialism. Have you ever made what someone did or did not give you for Christmas a sign of their love for you? If so, then you've struggled with materialism. Now, here's the question about all these questions. All of these materialistically driven things, did any of these things ever add any value to your Christmas? Did they make your Christmas more joyful, or did they just make it a little bit more stressful? Did they make the meaning of the Christmas season richer, or did they steal the meaning of the Christmas season from you? If they stole the meaning of the Christmas season from you, if you struggle with materialism, then you probably need to pause and ask yourself, why am I so obsessed with material things? And that's what takes us to our text for today. Because here's the thing, the materialism of Christmas, it's good for the economy, but it really can steal your joy. And so it's something with which we have to be cautious. And so we're going to turn to Luke 12 today as our text for today. And I want to begin by just giving you a little bit of background. We're going to start in Luke 12, beginning at verse 1. Luke 12, beginning at verse 1. When a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak to his disciples. And so at the beginning of Luke 12, we are introduced to a couple of different groups. On the one hand, we are introduced to the crowds. There's a crowd of many thousands that comes to see Jesus, and they're so excited to see Jesus that they are actually trampling over each other. This is a stampede to get close to Christ. Now, the other group that is in Luke 12, verse 1, is the group of Jesus' 12 disciples. And I want you to notice in Luke 12, verse 1, Jesus does something kind of fascinating. There's this crowd of thousands that wants to see Jesus, but Jesus does not seem too concerned with the crowd. Jesus instead, at the beginning of Luke 12, ignores the crowd so that he can talk to and teach his disciples. Now, the reason this is so important is because it kind of makes sense that the crowd would be excited to see Jesus. So far in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has healed a leper. Jesus has healed a paralyzed man. Jesus has healed a hemophiliac. Jesus has driven out demons. Jesus has calmed a storm. Jesus has fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus has raised some people from the dead. It only makes sense that after seeing all of these amazing things that Jesus has done, the crowds would be really excited to see Jesus. But then in Luke chapter 12, when they want to see Jesus, Jesus doesn't want to see them, it seems. He just wants to talk to his disciples. Now, let's say that you're a member of that crowd and you had traveled for a long time to see Jesus. You had walked on foot a long ways to see Jesus. You had trampled over other people to try to get close to Jesus, and then you finally get up to Jesus, and Jesus basically turns away from you and turns toward people that he's talking to all the time, and he won't even give you the time of day. Do you think this is going to set really well with you or not so well with you? It's probably going to set not so well with you. The crowds are not particularly pleased with this. And eventually, somebody in the crowd gets a little antsy. If you skip down to verse 13, somebody in the crowd interrupts Jesus when he's talking to his disciples, and he says to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Have you ever been in a conversation where you're trying to talk about one thing, but then somebody interrupts you with something that is totally off the subject because they really want to talk to you about some other thing? When I get home at the end of the day, I usually do a couple of different things. I give my wife a kiss, I give my kids some hugs, and I ask my wife how her day was. And she proceeds to try to give me a synopsis of her day. The problem is, a lot of times, when you got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, it's kind of hard to make it through even the Cliff's Notes version of your day, right? Because I'll be about 7 seconds into the conversation with Melody, and all of a sudden Hope will walk up and she'll say something like, "Mommy, Daddy, I'm hungry," or "Mommy, Daddy, I'm thirsty," or "Mommy, Daddy, are we going on a walk tonight?" or "Mommy, Daddy, can I watch a movie?" or "Mommy, Daddy, can I color?" or "Mommy, Daddy, can I go upstairs and play?" "Mommy, Daddy, can I do anything that will take you off the subject that you're trying to talk to each other about?" She's really only concerned with what's in her little mind because she's 4. Okay, here's Jesus. He's talking to his disciples. And if you go back and if you look at the beginning of Luke chapter 12, he's talking to his disciples about some pretty serious theological stuff. He's talking to his disciples about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders at the beginning of Luke 12. He's talking to his disciples about what it's going to be like on the last day when he comes back at the beginning of Luke chapter 12. He's talking to his disciples about how they're going to be persecuted for their faith at the beginning of Luke chapter 12. He's talking to his disciples about how God cares for every corner of his creation at the beginning of Luke chapter 12. He's talking to his disciples about the importance of confessing your faith even in a world that can be hostile to faith at the beginning of Luke chapter 12. All of this is pretty intense stuff. But then in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, somebody in the crowd finally gets sick of the theology because he wants to be a little bit more practical. He's tired of all the theological deep stuff and he says, Jesus, I got to interrupt because I need some help. I need you to read my brother the riot act, and I need you to tell him to divide my inheritance with me. Here's the thing, Jesus. I know you're trying to give your disciples a sermon, but I need more of a Tony Robbins seminar, okay? Tell me how to manage this money problem that I'm having. Now, here's what this guy is. We see it right out of the gate. This guy is a materialist because this guy is concerned with that which is material. Jesus is talking theology. This guy wants to know about money. Now, in this guy's defense, even in the first century, just so you know, just like in the 21st century, money was a really big deal. And just like families fight over inheritances in the 21st century, you know what families fought over in the first century? Inheritances as well. This was not an uncommon problem that this guy was having with his brother over an inheritance that he had received from his family. I want to show you a quote from something called the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is an ancient compendium of Jewish rabbinical teaching, and the rabbis actually had quite a bit to say about how families were supposed to divvy up and divide up inheritances. Here's what the rabbis said. Some relatives inherit from and transmit to each other. Some inherit but do not transmit. Some transmit but do not inherit. Some neither inherit nor transmit. The following inherit from and transmit to each other. A father inherits from and transmit to his sons, and sons inherit from and transmit to their father, and brothers from the same father inherit from and transmit to each other. A man inherits from his mother and from his wife, but does not transmit his estate to them if he dies first. And sisters' sons inherit from their uncles, but do not transmit their estates to them. A woman transmits her estate to her sons, and a wife to her husband, but they do not inherit from them. And mothers' brothers transmit their estate to their nephews, but do not inherit from them. And brothers from the same mother neither inherit from nor transmit to each other. Everybody got that? How many of you understood every word of that? How many of you heard something more like blah, 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 blah? Yeah, okay. So here's the thing. Here's the funny thing about this quote from the Babylonian Talmud. This isn't even the beginning of what the rabbis have to say about inheritances. In fact, this is the synopsis of what the rabbis are fixing to talk about when it comes to inheritances in the Babylonian Talmud. This is just like the abstract of what the rabbis are fixing to discuss. Even in the ancient world, a lot of people had a lot of stuff to say about inheritances. But there's one line that I want to pull out of this synopsis, and it's this line. Brothers from the same father inherit from and transmit to each other. This little line right here actually gets to something known as the law of primogeniture. Pastor mentioned this in his sermon. Here's the way the law of primogeniture worked. In the ancient world in the first century, if you were the oldest son, you would inherit everything of the family estate when your father passed away, because you would become the new patriarch of the family, and this was a patriarchal society. And as the oldest son, as the one who inherited everything from your father, it would be your responsibility as kind of the new patriarch of the household to take care of the household, to share everything that you had inherited with your sisters, with your brothers, with your aunts, with your uncles, with your mother, with your wife, with your kids, with whoever. You would be the person who would essentially turn into the executor of your father's estate. And so the rabbis say, brothers from the same father, they inherit from their father, but only one gets the whole enchilada, and then he transmits it to all of his other brothers, all of his younger brothers. And so here is this younger brother, it seems, in Luke chapter 12, and it looks like his older brother isn't doing a very good job with the law of primogeniture. He's inherited everything from his father, but he doesn't seem to want to share much of anything from his father. And so this younger brother feels like he's been gypped. This younger brother feels like he's been cheated. And so he goes to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, I need you to step in here and tell my older brother to do his eldest brother responsibility. Divide the family estate from my father in a fair and equitable way. To which Jesus replies, Luke 12, verse 14, Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Now, this is kind of a fascinating response from Jesus. Here's why. Jesus really says to this guy, who am I to judge? Who am I to judge what's going on here? I'm not going to get involved with your personal financial dispute with your brother. Now, part of the reason what Jesus says here is so fascinating has to do with the word that Jesus uses, the word arbiter. In Greek, this is the word maristis. Who appointed me a judge or a maristis between you, Jesus says. Now, what's really funny about this word is that Jesus uses this same word a little bit later in the same chapter. Luke 12, verse 51, where Jesus says, Do you think that I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, I came to bring division. Greek word for division there is the word maristis. And so here's what Jesus does. In Luke 12, verse 51, Jesus says, I'm a maristis. I can maristis right from wrong. I can maristis righteousness from sinfulness. I can maristis light from darkness. I can be an arbiter between all of those things. Luke 12, verse 51. But then when somebody comes to Jesus in Luke 12, verse 14 and says, Jesus, I need you to be a maristis for me, Jesus says, I'm sorry, I'm not a maristis. Now, here's the quandary this sets up. Which one is it? Is Jesus a maristis like he says he is in Luke 12, verse 51? Or is Jesus not a maristis like he says he's not in Luke 12, verse 14? Which one is it? It's both. You see, Jesus knows something about what this man is asking him to maristis. He knows that what this man is asking him to maristis is not right. Because this man's request actually has nothing to do with fairness. It has nothing to do with equity. It has nothing to do with receiving what is rightfully his from his Father. This man's request has everything to do with materialism. And that materialism, no matter what this man gets from his brother, will never be satisfied. It will never find joy. This is why Jesus continues verse 15. When he says, I'm not going to be your maristis, he turns to the crowd and he subsequently says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Another word I want you to pick up on, this word greed. In Greek, this is the word pleonexia, made up of two different parts. One part is the word polis, it means more. Echo is a Greek word that means to have, and this is really what the definition of greed is. Greed is when you want to have more, whatever that more is. You want to have more money? That's greed. You want to have more clothes? That's greed. You want to have more toys? That's greed. You want to have more power? That's greed. You want to have more stature? That's greed. You want to have more fame? That's greed. You want to have more space? That's greed. You want to have more free time? That's greed. You want to have more inheritance like this guy does? That's greed. Whatever it is you want more of, that is probably the spot at which you struggle with greed. Pleonexia means I want to have more. Here's the problem with pleonexia. When you actually get more, you know what you want? More. The problem with pleonexia is that pleonexia is never satisfied. No matter how much you have, you always want more. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 8. All things are wearisome. More than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing. The ear never has its fill of hearing. The wise man of Ecclesiastes says, it's never going to be enough if you have pleonexia, because you will always want to have more. Your life, Jesus says, cannot consist in the abundance of your possessions. You know, there's a real interesting line in the book of 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul's writing here. He says, 1 Corinthians 7, beginning at verse 29, "From now on, those who have wives should live as if they did not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away." You know, when you read these verses out of context, they can almost seem and feel a little bit befuddling and puzzling. Jesus is saying, okay, if you have a spouse, live like you don't have a spouse. What does that mean? You live like a bachelor? What is this? That's not what Paul is getting at. But he does know something about everything that we have in life. Everything. From the emotions that we feel, to the stuff that we buy, even to the people like we love, like our spouses. All of those things can be gone in an instant. That's why Paul says, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 31, "For this world in its present form is passing away." And so if the sum total of your life is nothing more than the stuff that you have, you're only going to die brokenhearted. Because the stuff that you have is going to pass away. Along the road of life, the stuff that you have is going to get lost. It is going to get broken. It is going to betray you. It is going to hurt you. And so if you live your whole life just wanting more and more, or just living your whole life according to what you have, your whole life isn't going to amount to much. And this leads us to the story, to this little parable that Jesus tells. Because Jesus knows that kind of materialism, making your whole life the sum total of the stuff that you have, is a dangerous way to live. Because it can be gone in an instant. And so Jesus tells this story about a man who had it all, but lost it all. Luke 12, verse 16, Jesus told the crowd a parable. Quick note on this word parable. The word parable in Greek, it's the word parabole, made up of two different parts. Para means alongside, balo means to throw, and so a parable is kind of like this. Jesus has a truth that he wants to teach, and so he throws a story alongside the truth to kind of make the story, or to kind of make the truth a little bit more understandable. To make the truth a little bit more realistic and practical and palpable and accessible for people. And so Jesus tells a parable and he says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest." Now, right out of the gate in the first line of this parable, there are a couple of things that I want you to notice. First thing I want you to notice is how the parable begins. It begins like this: the ground. Those two words are really important because it tells us what gives a rich man a very abundant harvest. What gives a rich man a very abundant harvest? The first two words, the what? The ground. Okay, is it that this rich man has come up with some new method of sowing and tilling that is so awesome that he gets an abundant harvest? Yes or no? No. Is it that this rich man has just installed a cutting-edge irrigation system that gave him the edge over all the other pieces of land all around him so that he's received an abundant harvest? Yes or no? No. Is it that this rich man has just come up with the best fertilizer mix out there, which has made him get an abundant harvest? Yes or no? No. The rich man does not do anything to produce an abundant harvest. The abundant harvest is given to him by what? By the ground. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Now, part of the reason this is such an important lesson to keep in mind is because we need to remember that what we have is not based on who we are. Sometimes we can be real tempted to believe that what we have is based on our hard work, right? Our fiscal savvy, our incredible ingenuity. We know how to invest wisely. We know how to do all the right things. And because we know how to do all this stuff, we have all this stuff. That's not the way that having stuff works. Paul asked this great question in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7. It's meant to be a rhetorical question. What do you have that you did not receive? And the answer is nothing. Everything comes from somewhere else. In other words, we all have ground. We all have something that produces stuff for us, not because of us, but a lot of times even in spite of us. Now, the ground for our existence is God Himself. He is the one who gives us everything that we have. And so this rich man has ground, and the ground is what does all the work. The ground is what does all the growing. The ground of this rich man is the one who yields him an abundant harvest. And this leads me to the second word that I want you to pick up on, this word abundant. In Greek, I love this. This is the word euphareo. We get our English word euphoria from this. And so here's the idea. This harvest is so abundant, it's kind of like winning the Powerball. It can send you into euphoria. It can make you really excited. It can make you giddy with joy. It can make your skin crawl, your hair stand on end, because it is just so thrilling. This is the kind of crop that would set you up for the rest of your life. This is the kind of crop that would ensure that this rich man never would have to work again a day in his life. If he wanted to go on a cruise, he could do it. If he wanted to build a bunch of homes, he could do it. If he wanted to go to Vegas and have a really good time, he could do it. No matter what he wanted to do, he could do it. Now, here's the funny thing about this rich man. Even though this rich man could do anything that he wanted with his money, he doesn't do anything that he wanted to with his money. Luke 12, verse 17, he thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store all my crops. I'm just not going to go and blow it. No. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'm going to tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store up my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat and drink and be merry." This man doesn't let euphoria get the best of him. This man does what your parents told you to do. This man says, okay, I have this huge financial windfall. I'm not going to spend it, this man says. I'm going to what? Save it. I'm going to store it up. Now, if you're listening to this story, it sounds like this guy is a pretty fiscally responsible guy. It sounds like this guy is a really smart financial man. But a couple of cracks begin to appear in his character. The first crack that we see has to do in the pronouns that he uses. He thought to himself, verse 17, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he says, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns, and I will build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain stored up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. You notice a little cadence in this guy's discussion? I, my, I, my, I. Who's this guy all about? Himself. Okay, does he mention anybody else in this little conversation that he has with himself? Yes or no? No. Does he even think of anybody else in this little conversation that he has with himself? Yes or no? No. It's just all about I, my. It's my money, my grain, my barns, my stuff, my riches, my wealth, my future, my security. It's all about me, this guy says. Now, this leads me to the second thing that I want you to notice. Notice how isolated this guy is. The reason he probably doesn't think about anybody else is because he doesn't have anyone else. In verse 17, it begins by saying that this rich man thought to himself. And then he begins to have this little internal conversation with himself about what he's going to do with his bumper crop. But then, in the middle of this little internal conversation about what he's going to do with his bumper crop, verse 19 says that he says to himself, and I'll say to myself. And so this guy is literally talking to himself about talking to himself. That's what he's doing. He's having an internal conversation with himself about having an internal conversation with himself. This guy is turned in on himself. He is a complete recluse. He does not see anybody outside of himself. You know, there's this fascinating line, Isaiah 5, verse 8. The prophet says, woe to you who add house to house and join field to field until no space is left. And then this tragic line, and you live alone in the land. The prophet Isaiah lived during a time where a lot of people had a lot of wealth. And so they would add house upon house and field upon field. They would expand their territory. They would grow their riches. But you know what that finally left them? It finally left them alone. Isaiah says those people who add house to house and add field to field, they wind up living all alone in the land. Their riches shut them off from the rest of the world. That's what's going on with this guy. His riches has shut him off from the rest of the world. My. I'm going to talk to myself about talking to myself. Because I got nobody else to talk to. This guy is extraordinarily rich in grain, but tragically poor in relationships. And this leads me to the final thing that I want you to notice. He says in verse 18, I'm going to tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. That little word surplus. I'm not too big on the NIV translation of this word. It's the word pas. And it's a word that literally means all. This guy says, okay, I got this bumper crop. I have this windfall amount of grain. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to store it pas. I'm going to store it all. Not just the stuff that I have left over, not just the surplus, not just the stuff that I have left after I go and have a good time with it. No. I'm going to take every last stock of it, every last bit of it, and I'm going to put it all into a barn. I'm going to save every last bit of this grain. I went to a Dave Ramsey seminar, and I know that I'm supposed to save it all, this guy says. Okay, we would call this guy a financially conservative guy, a financially responsible guy. This guy's not going to spend too much. He's going to save. He's going to do this right. Everybody listening to this story in Jesus' day would have thought to themselves, hey, this guy knows what he's doing. In fact, notice, he's planning for his retirement, right? Because once he saves it, what is he going to be able to do? He'll stop working eventually, and then when he stops working eventually, he's going to take life easy, he says. He's going to eat and drink and be merry. Now, this line is fascinating because it actually reveals something about this guy. This guy is a person of faith because this line, take life easy, eat and drink and be merry, this is straight out of Ecclesiastes 8, verse 15, where Solomon says, I commend the enjoyment of life, because there's nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. And this verse is probably the verse this guy's thinking about. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to save it all now. I'm going to use it for retirement. Doesn't matter if I live to be 95, 100, 105. Don't worry. My IRA is now huge. It'll be fine. I'll be good. I can take life easy. I can eat. I can drink. I can be merry. But here's the really funny thing about this line from Ecclesiastes 8. This eat and drink and be merry line, that's not the only spot that it pops up in the Old Testament. It also pops up in the book of the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 22, verse 13. Isaiah says, see, there is joy and revelry. There is merriment, the slaughtering of cattle and the killing of sheep, eating of meat and drinking of wine. Let us eat and drink. They're all going to be merry, you say, for tomorrow we die. Now, that's a somewhat substantially less encouraging verse than the Ecclesiastes 8 one. And so we got Ecclesiastes 8, and here's what Solomon is doing in Ecclesiastes 8, okay? He is commending to us the enjoyment of life. There is something to be said for enjoying life. It's not good to walk around forlorn. It's not good to walk around with tight fists. It's not good to walk around enjoying none of the gifts that God has given to us. We can enjoy life. But then in Isaiah 22, Isaiah kind of gives us the counterbalance to that. He says, okay, you can enjoy life, but you also need to be warned about the fleetingness of life. Because life can be gone just like that. You can eat, you can drink, you can be merry, and then tomorrow you can die. You can enjoy life. Just forget that life, at least this one, doesn't go on forever. You know what the rich man in Jesus' parable forgot? He remembered the enjoyment of life. He remembered Ecclesiastes 8. But he forgot about Isaiah 22. He forgot about the fleetingness of life. Luke 12, verse 20, God shows up in Jesus' story. And God says to this rich man, you fool. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This man's money could buy him a lot of stuff. It could buy him a lot of wood to build bigger barns. It could buy him a very comfortable retirement where he could eat and drink and be merry. But the one thing this man's money could not buy him, the one thing that this man's grain could not afford him, was another day on this earth. He was prepared for the enjoyment of life. He just forgot about the fleetingness of life. And so God says, you are a fool. Seems like kind of a rude insult, doesn't it? But there's actually kind of an interesting little word play that's going on here. The word for fool here is the word aphron. When the guy talks to himself about eating and drinking and being merry, the word for merry is the word euphron. And so this guy thinks he's going to be euphron. God shows up and he says, no, you're really just an aphron. You're really just a fool. Why? Well, this very night, your life's going to be demanded from you, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? You've talked to yourself about talking to yourself. You've said, I, my, I, over and over and over again, but you've never thought about anybody else. You should have. Because now all the stuff that you've talked to yourself about talking to yourself to keep, where is it going to go now? The adage is true. You can't take it with you. And so Jesus concludes, verse 21, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. This is how it will be, Jesus says, when you are affected by and fooled by materialism. When you make your whole life the sum total of stuff that you have stored away in a barn. It's a foolish way to live. Here's what I want to do in the time that we have remaining. I want to talk about what this parable teaches us about materialism, because it really does teach us some really profound things. Just 3 things that it teaches us about materialism. First thing it teaches us is this. Materialism really can affect everyone. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter how much or how little you have. Materialism really can affect everyone. Notice what Jesus says in verse 21, the very last line when he sums up the parable. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. The word that I want you to pick up on there in verse 21 is the word whoever. You know what the word whoever means? It means whoever. Doesn't matter who you are, whoever you are, you can be affected by materialism. Whatever socioeconomic status you find yourself at, you can be affected by materialism. Sometimes people who are terribly impoverished can be affected by materialism. You know why? They see what other people have and they see what they don't have, and they begin to get a little bit of pleonexia for what other people have. They say, if I could just have a little bit more. Sometimes this comes out in all sorts of terrible ways, where people not only say, I would like that, they go out and get that by trying to steal that. You know what that is? It's materialism. If you're middle class, and you think to yourself, you know what, I'm doing okay, but boy, oh boy, I sure could use that promotion, or boy, oh boy, I sure could use that raise, or boy, oh boy, I sure could use that status change. I'm going to keep on climbing the ladder. I'm going to keep on doing a little bit better. I'm going to keep on trampling on somebody else so that I can get a little bit higher, because I'm really not quite satisfied where I'm at. You know what that is? It's materialism. Thinking to yourself, man, oh man, I just need a little bit more. And then when you get a little bit more, you want a little bit more. You go from lower middle class to upper middle class. Where are you going to go after that? Got to keep on going. It's materialism. Rich people can be affected by materialism, even if they could have everything they could ever possibly want. Sometimes you have so much you become superficial and absorbed in your own stuff. You start talking to yourself about talking to yourself, just like this guy did in this parable. I love this line from Augustine, one of my favorite synopses of this whole parable. The great church father says, the rich man didn't realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer than the storerooms of his barns. The reason I love that line is because it's just a good reminder that, you know what, if you acquire all this stuff, and if you store up all this stuff, and if you keep all this stuff, and if you have all this stuff, and you don't think about anybody else when it comes to your stuff, you're a fool. You've fallen prey to materialism. Here's kind of the bottom line on materialism. Materialism has nothing to do with how much you have. Materialism has everything to do with where you're focused. If you're focused on stuff, having more stuff, getting more stuff, acquiring more stuff, or just being absorbed in the stuff that you do have, that's materialism. And this much I know: it will not bring you joy. It can, however, rob your soul. Materialism can affect everybody. Second lesson on materialism that we can take away from this story is this: materialism can not only affect everybody, materialism can affect everything. Sometimes we tend to think of materialism only in terms of like what we have in the bank, right? Okay, I don't have enough in the bank, I want more in the bank, that's materialism. Okay, I have a lot in the bank, I'm kind of turned in on that stuff in the bank, okay, that's materialism. But materialism is more than just what's in your bank account. It's more than the precious heirlooms that you have in your house. It's more than the number of cars that are sitting in your driveway. It's more than any of that stuff. Materialism is actually a whole world view. Because materialism actually affects how you look at this life and whether you remember that there is anything beyond this life. It's a whole world view. That's part of the problem this guy had in this parable. He was only looking at this life. He had forgotten that there was something that was supposed to be beyond this life. Materialism only looks at the material. That's part of the problem with it. There's this fascinating line from something called the Epistle to Diognetus. I came across this just the other day. And it's a piece of Christian literature from the 2nd century, and it's meant to be a defense of the Christian faith in a world, because in the 2nd century the world was not friendly toward Christians. So it's meant to be a defense of the Christian faith in a world where a lot of people hate Christians. And there's this great line in the Epistle to Diognetus that says, Christians have a common table, but not a common bed. Okay, here's what's going on here in the Epistle to Diognetus. The Epistle to Diognetus is saying, here's what Christians are known for. They're known for their generosity. They open up their homes, they open up their tables, they open up everything that they have to give to others. They don't just store it up, they give it out. That's what Christians are known for. But at the same time, they have a common table, they don't have a common bed. Believe it or not, in the 2nd century, nothing like the 21st century, but in the 2nd century, they lived in a fairly sexually promiscuous culture. We are really buttoned up in this culture. But in the 2nd century, man, they just kind of let it all hang loose. And so Christians in a sexually promiscuous culture, they were also not only known for their generosity, but their fidelity. Where other people would sleep around, they would stick with their spouse. And this was countercultural in the 2nd century, because in the 2nd century, this never happens in the 21st century, but in the 2nd century, a lot of people reversed this. They lived the inverse of this. They wouldn't have a common table, they'd store up a bunch of stuff for themselves, but they would have a common bed, where they would go and sleep around and try to get their thrills and kicks and all of that stuff. You know why? Because in the 2nd century, they were materialists, and it affected everything. Not just what they had in their bank account, but even what they did in their bed. Because here's the thing. If you're a materialist, you're going to be worried about what you have in your bank account, but then again, you're also just going to live for what you can get out of this life, because there's nothing beyond this life. You never think about anything beyond this life. And so if sex is fun in this life, hey, I'll just go and get as much of that as I possibly can. If alcohol gives me joy in this life, okay, I'll just go and drink as much as I possibly can. If partying is what is really fun in this life, okay, I'll go and party just as much as I can. You live for this world, you never think of the next. That's what materialism does. It's not just about what you have and what you want. It's about how you live. The Epistle to Diognetus is a great reminder that Christians take materialism and they turn it upside down. They say, we are living for more than this world. we are living for more than this life. And so we are generous and we are faithful, all at the same time. We are inclusive. We invite people to our table. But we are exclusive. We have just one spouse. Because we are living for a God who says that there is so much more to this world than this world. Materialism affects everything. That's the second lesson we can learn from this. Third lesson we can learn from Jesus' little story here is that materialism, it really can blind you to eternity. You lose sight of what's beyond this world. This guy lost sight of what was beyond the grave. He had barns, he had grain, and he thought that's all he needed. You know, there's another fascinating parable that Jesus tells a little bit later in the Gospel of Luke. Luke 16, beginning at verse 1, Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man, kind of like in Luke 12. There's another rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. And so he called the manager in and he asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be my manager any longer." And the manager said to himself, "Well, what shall I do now? My master has taken away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And the manager told him, "All right, take your bill, sit down quickly, and let's cut it in half. 450. Then he asked the second, "Okay, how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. And he said, "Okay, let's take 20% off the top. Take that debt and make it 800 bushels of wheat." Now the master finds out what the dishonest manager is doing, verse 8, and you know what the master does? The master commends the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And then Jesus kind of offers a little commentary on this parable. He says, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Now, a lot of people, when they read this parable, they're a little bit puzzled by it. Have you ever been puzzled by it? Because here's this guy, right? He's fixing to be fired by his manager for being kind of a big galoot. He's not doing a good job managing what his manager wants him to manage. And he knows that he's fixing to be fired, and so what does he do? Well, he goes and he cooks his manager's books. He says, "Okay, I'm going to call in all these people who owe my manager money, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to reduce what they owe my manager. That way all these people will owe me one, so that when I get fired, I can call in favors, and I can have a roof to sleep under. I can have food on the table until I can find a new job." That's what this guy does. And when the manager who's fixing to fire this guy who's watching all his stuff, when his boss finds out what he's doing, what does he do? He commends this dishonest man. And a lot of people wonder, well, why in the world would this guy commend a dishonest man? Well, it's not because he's dishonest. It's because he's shrewd. The master commended, Jesus says, the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Here's what this dishonest manager was doing. He was using his money to do something smart. It was wrong, but it was very smart. Now, the point that Jesus wants to pull away from this parable is not this: we should be dishonest like this man was dishonest. No. The point that Jesus wants us to pull away from this parable is this: just like this man was smart with his money, we should be smart with our money. How are you smart with your money? Jesus says, here's how you're smart with your money. Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, because one day it'll be gone. But if you use it to gain friends for yourselves, you and your friends are going to be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Here's what Jesus is essentially saying. He's saying, okay, take your money and use it to witness to the world. Take your money, use it to make friends. Take your money, use it to bless others. Take your money, use it to draw others to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what you do with your money. Because when you do that with your money, when your money's gone, the people that you witness to with your money will last into eternity. And that is very smart, Jesus says. And so here's the question. What are you doing with your money this season? What are you about materially this season? Here's the bottom line when it comes to materialism. A spirit of materialism will always focus on this. What can I afford? Can I afford this? Can I afford that? Can I buy this? Can I buy that? Can I charge this? Can I charge that? But the true spirit of Christmas never focuses on what you can afford. It only focuses on what you can give. And there is a difference. Because the true spirit of Christmas knows that Christmas is all about a gift that we could never afford. We can't afford the forgiveness of God. We can't afford the grace of God. We can't afford the mercy of God. We can't afford the salvation of God. It's not a gift that you can afford. It is only a gift that you can receive. And so during this time of year, we don't worry about what we can afford. We reflect on how God gave. And we take what He has given and once again hold it out to the world. That is how you break free from the spirit of materialism. You stop looking at your bank account and you start looking at the cross. Because in the cross, there is a gift. In the cross, there is something that outlasts barns and grain and savings accounts and money market accounts and stocks and bonds and homes and boats and cars and decorations and trappings that so often suck the joy from this season. Jesus is what we need this season and every day. He's not materialism. He's salvation. And that's what this season is all about. Keep that in mind, will you? Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, we are full speed ahead into Christmas, and we know that there's a lot that can suck the joy out of this season. And so, in a time of financial stress for so many, I pray that you would bring perfect peace. And we focus not so much on what we can afford, but on what you've given. Because we can never afford what you have given, we can only receive it. And may that be the first thing that we look at this season. May that be the first thing that we desire to share this season. May that be the first thing that we desire to give this season. Because that is the first thing that lasts even until the last day. We thank you for that. And we pray in the name of your greatest gift, Jesus, your Son, our Savior. Amen. Have a good week. Walk with light.